Hello, I'm Keith Hocton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. Someone asked me the other day how often I think about ancient Rome. And I have to be honest with you, I think about Rome in one way, shape, or form daily. Genuinely, most days. Something drifts across my mind. An aqueduct, a bad emperor, what bread was like. But here's the thing, I didn't admit to them because I think it makes me sound stranger still. It's not only Rome. Some mornings I wake up before I'm properly awake and I think, what if I opened my eyes and it wasn't this morning at all? What if I woke up in the 14th century? And then the questions start arriving one after another. Would I even understand the language? Was English back then anything like the English that I'm speaking to you now? Could I ask where the water was without being laughed out of the village? And the big one, I guess, the one I keep circling back to, if I woke up there tomorrow, would I survive a single day? And I've actually thought about this at length. And I have to tell you, I don't think I would. I think I'd be dead before lunchtime. So this is what today's about. A day in the 14th century, one hazard at a time, and a running question for you at home. Would you make it? Would you survive to see the evening? Genuinely, I'd like to know whether you would actually last longer than I would, because the bar, I promise you, it's not that high. So imagine waking up on an ordinary spring morning in England, somewhere around the year 1350. The light coming through the doorway is grey and thin because you almost certainly have no glass in your windows. A neighbour's cockerel is complaining about the dawn, and the fire in the middle of your floor has burned down to a sullen red glow. You are, let's just say, about 30 years old. And here is the first surprising thing about your situation. At 30, you already count as a survivor. You're not old exactly, but you're seasoned. You have lived through the deadliest years a medieval person ever faces, and a fair number of people that you were actually born alongside, are already dead, lying in the churchyard. So I'm going to walk you through a single ordinary day in that world, one hazard at a time, and ask a deceptively simple question. How hard was it, really, just to stay alive? We tend to picture the Middle Ages as either a romantic pageant, don't we, of knights and castles, or, at the other end of the spectrum, a filthy pit of misery. And the truth turns out, I think, to sit somewhere far more interesting than either extreme. I should also say at the outlet that we're going to spend most of our time in the world of an ordinary peasant, because that's where the overwhelming majority of people actually lived. There were nobles in their drafty manor houses and merchants in the growing towns, and their experience was completely different in important ways. But for perhaps 9 out of 10 people, life meant working the land in a small rural community. That's the vantage point from which everything today will be described. And keep one thing in mind as we go, because I think it frames the entire picture. These were not helpless victims kind of stumbling through a nightmare. They were actually incredibly resourceful, resilient people who understood their world intimately and had worked out through generations of hard experience 1,000 small strategies for staying alive within it. So right at the beginning of this podcast, I asked whether I would even understand the language. And I want to come back to that because the answer is a little bit stranger than you might think. You wouldn't be dropped into a world of, these and thous that you could just about muddle through. The English of 1350, what we now call Middle English, would hit your ear as very nearly a foreign tongue. You might be able to snatch a word here and there, but a flowing sentence from a Kentish farmer would leave you completely stranded. And part of the reason is a peculiar thing linguists call the Great Vowel Shift, a wholesale rearrangement of how English vowels were actually pronounced that hadn't yet happened in 1350, and it wouldn't finish until about 1700. So before that shift, the long vowels sounded much closer to Latin or to modern Italian. So a word that you would recognize instantly on the page came out of the mouth sounding nothing like it does today. They actually rolled their R's. They actually pronounced the K in night, so it was knight. And the whole music of the language simply wasn't the music that you know now. And of course, there was no such thing as standard English to fall back on either. The language splintered into regional dialects, so distinct that a man from Yorkshire and a man from Kent, other ends of the country, would genuinely struggle to follow one another, never mind a bewildered visitor from 600 years in the future. On top of that, English wasn't even the language of power. The church actually conducted its business in Latin, and for generations after the Norman conquest, the nobility and the law courts in England ran on French, which is why so many of our grand and legal words, court and justice, beef and mutton, arrived by that route, while the humble ones stayed stubbornly English. So if you woke up in that village tomorrow, you wouldn't only be poor and filthy and hopelessly unskilled, you would also be, for all practical purposes, unable to tell anyone anything. Chaucer was actually writing his Canterbury Tales in this very period. And if you have ever tried to read them in the original, you already know the feeling. You catch perhaps a third of it on the page, and if someone actually read it aloud to you, you would be lost before the end of one sentence. So let's clear up the biggest myth first, because almost everyone gets it wrong. You've probably heard that medieval people barely lived past 30. Well, that figure's real, but it doesn't mean what it sounds like. Life expectancy at birth in this period often hovered around 30 years. Yet that number, it's an average, and averages can lie a little bit. And the reason it sits so low is not that 30 years old people were just dropping dead, kind of walking down the street. It's just that a staggering number of children never made it that far to begin with. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of all children died before their 5th birthday. And of course, plenty more were lost between childhood and adulthood. So let me just put that in human terms for a moment. If 30 children were playing together in your village on an ordinary afternoon, perhaps 10 of them would never live to grow up. Every one of those small deaths pulls that average down. But if you were tough enough, or lucky enough, or if you were tough enough and lucky enough to survive the perilous gauntlet of early childhood, your prospects improved dramatically. A person who reached the age of 20 could reasonably expect to see their 50s, and reaching 60 or 70. And look, it was uncommon, but it was far from astonishing. So when I say you're an old survivor at 30, I mean something really specific. The dangerous lottery of childhood is behind you. That's the important thing. Now you simply have to survive everything else. So since childhood was the deadliest gauntlet of all, I think it's worth pausing to understand why so many of the youngest never survived it, because the reasons reveal a great deal about the fragility of this entire world. The most dangerous moment often came around the time when a child was weaned from its mother's milk and introduced to ordinary food and water. That simple transition removed a crucial layer of natural protection and actually exposed the infant directly to the contaminated water and the incredibly unsanitary conditions that I've already described a little bit. And diarrhea illness swept away enormous numbers of small children as a result. The home itself was actually full of hazards for the very young. You had an open central fire in a dim, crowded room, And of course, that's a constant threat to an unsteady toddler. And accidental burns and scalds were tragically frequent. Ponds, wells, streams, and water-filled ditches, well, they also lay close at hand, and drowning actually claimed many curious children who wandered too far while their exhausted parents were actually occupied with work. And of course, you should never mistake this grim arithmetic for indifference. You know, the old idea that medieval parents held themselves back from loving children who might not survive, that's been largely overturned by historians. The surviving records make it painfully clear that mothers and fathers grieved their lost children deeply, exactly as any parent would, and that the sheer frequency of the loss never made it easier to bear. So let's begin where your day begins, inside your own home, because your home is quietly conspiring against you. Picture a single dim room with a floor of beaten earth, walls of timber and dub, and a roof of thick, dry thatch. There's no chimney, because for ordinary families, the chimney is still a luxury that hasn't arrived. Instead, a fire smolders in the center of the room, and the smoke simply drifts up and hangs in the roof before leaking out through the gaps. That basically means that you spend every winter breathing a permanent indoor haze of wood smoke and peat smoke. Years of that probably left countless people with badly damaged lungs. Your lungs are effectively working a night shift inside a bonfire. And the smoke is only the slow danger. The fast danger is hanging directly over your head, because that beautiful dry thatch is astonishingly flammable. A single stray spark, an untended flame, a gust of wind that you weren't expecting at the wrong moment, and the fire can climb into the roof in seconds. And keep in mind also, houses stood close together and were built of timber and straw, so a blaze in one home would instantly leap to the next. Your entire village could actually genuinely be gone before lunchtime. So before you face the day, you have to get dressed. And here's something that genuinely surprised me when I first came across it. You wouldn't have a wardrobe to choose from. For an ordinary peasant, clothing was so laborious and so expensive to produce that most people owned, in effect, one set of working clothes. If they were fortunate, a little bit more well-to-do, they also had one best outfit that they kept for Sundays and feast days. And that's it. That's your entire collection. So think for a moment about what a single garment actually cost in human effort. The wool had to be shorn from the sheep. It then had to be cleaned and combed and then spun into thread by hand, usually by the woman of the household in every spare hour that they had, and only then woven into cloth and cut and sewn. A plain woolen tunic could represent months of somebody's labor. Clothes weren't something you bought on a whim and discarded. They were a genuine form of the family's wealth. And because they were so valuable, clothes were mended endlessly and then handed down from parent to child and listed in wills, honestly, as serious bequests. You know, a good gown or a warm cloak was worth leaving to someone actually by name. And of course, they were never washed the way you might imagine. You know, your linen undershirt worn next to your skin could be laundered, and it was, because linen took happily to water and lye could be laid out in the sun to dry. But the heavy wool worn over the top was rarely ever washed at all. You literally would brush the dirt off it and wear it. And then you would continue wearing it for years to come until literally it fell off your back. And of course, there's one final twist too. By a law passed in 1363, you weren't free to dress how you pleased. These sumptuary laws laid down precisely what fabrics and colors each rank of society was actually permitted to wear. And a peasant was expected to stay in coarse, undyed cloth. Your clothing effectively announced your place in the order of things before you'd even said a single word, which, given the language problem we just talked about, well, is probably just as well. So that law of 1363 is actually worth dwelling on just for a moment, because it's one of the most revealing documents this whole century produced. It was called, I think rather wonderfully, the Statute Concerning Diet and Apparel. And it tried to pin every rank of society into its correct costume. At the very bottom of that ladder, you had the laborers and the servants, and they were held to plain, cheap cloth, and they were forbidden by law to wear silk or fine fur or jewelry of any kind. A serving woman wasn't even permitted a veil worth more than a shilling. A step up from that, you had a yeoman and craftsman. Well, they could wear somewhat better wool, but still nothing imported or luxurious. Merchants, depending on their wealth, were allowed finer stuff again. Yet they were actually kept away from the costliest furs and ornaments. And then, rung by rung, came the gentlemen, the esquires, the knights, and the great nobles, each granted a little more splendor than the last, until at the very top, the highest nobility alone could wear the richest silks and velvets, cloths of gold, and two furs that shouted rank louder than anything else in medieval England: ermine and sable. And notice this, because it's really telling. The rules didn't stop at the man of the house. They reached his wife and his children too, so that an entire household actually announced its exact station at a single glance. And of course, it wasn't only about the clothes either, though that part tends to be forgotten. The same statute pushed right into the dining hall, laying down what servants could be fed, part of a wider medieval habit of trying to cap how lavish a meal each rank was actually allowed to serve. And you can plainly see what this whole thing was for. It was meant to keep the social hierarchy visible, to stop people from climbing above their berth simply by dressing the part. And I guess also to nudge everyone towards home-produced English wool and away from the expensive foreign luxuries. But I think underneath it all, to reinforce a deeply held belief that your place in society had been ordained by God, and it ought to be legible on your very back. So the question then begs, did it work? Well, not really, and that's the most interesting part of all. The apparel rules proved so unpopular that they were rescinded almost at once, within a year or so of being passed. Local officials had neither the appetite nor the means to go policing people's wardrobes. Fashion moved faster than any statute ever could. And a rich merchant who fancied a fur-trimmed gown would often simply just wear it and then pay the fine. Historians tend to read the law, I think, less as a set of rules that were to be obeyed and more as a window into the anxieties that really kind of befell the English elite. Because England kept passing new versions of it over and over for literally centuries afterwards, which rather gives away how badly the first attempts failed. And here's why I think it belongs in this century in particular. The law arrived right in the wake of the Black Death, and that's no coincidence. With so many workers dead, wages had risen, and ordinary people had money in their pockets that they'd never known before. A prosperous village wool merchant might now have had enough to buy himself a velvet gown trimmed with fur. But the law insisted he actually dressed like a merchant and not like a knight. That tension between new wealth pushing up and old privilege pushing down, well, it's one of the defining struggles of England through the centuries. And you could basically read the whole of it in a single coat. Before we even reach the question of food, we should acknowledge the sheer physical labor that structured almost every waking hour. Because for the overwhelming majority of people, life was actually defined by relentless grinding work. You are, in all probability, a peasant farmer, which means your body is the primary engine of your household survival. There are no machines to spare your muscles and no weekends to restore them. From the first grey light of dawn until the falling light of evening, the land effectively makes continual demands that cannot safely be postponed. People today, it's really interesting as a comparison, live by the clock and the calendar. Medieval people lived by the seasons. The agricultural year would have been a merciless calendar of obligations. In spring, you plow the heavy, waterlogged soil behind a straining team of oxen. Then you physically sow the seed by hand across the open fields. Through summer, you weed, you tend the growing crops, and you dread the storms that could flatten a season's hope in an afternoon. Autumn then brings the frantic urgency of the harvest, where every abled body works until it can barely stand, because the difference between a crop gathered and a crop rotted in the rain, well, that's actually the difference between eating and starvation. This ceaseless physical toil accumulated across a lifetime, and it showed. Skeletons from that period reveal worn-out joints, damaged spines, and very arthritic hands in people who were, by our standards, still comparatively young. Your body was a tool, and like every tool, it wore out with use. So you would get up in the morning, you would cough your way out of the smoke, and you think about food. And this is where medieval life reveals just how fragile it truly was. Because there are no supermarkets, no reliable long-distance supply chains, and absolutely no way to store abundance against disaster. Nearly everything you'll eat this year depends on one thing: last year's harvest. Your survival is chained directly to the weather, the soil, and a run of good fortune you can't control. So consider how many things had to go right. One wet summer, one early frost, one outbreak of crop disease, one lord demanding an extra share of grain, and suddenly the margin between having enough and having nothing vanishes. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 showed the whole of Northern Europe exactly how thin that margin was. Years of relentless rain rotted the crops in the fields, livestock sickened and died, and bread became desperately scarce. And the records from those years, well, they're genuinely harrowing. Families abandoned children they couldn't feed, literally left them on the roadside to die, and there are even scattered reports of cannibalism taking place. This wasn't some remote catastrophe. It was living memory for the older people in your village. So even in an ordinary year, many peasants lived permanently on the edge of hunger. Your diet would have been built around bread and a very thick vegetable pottage, kind of simmered in a single pot, probably flavored with onions and beans, peas, and perhaps a little cheese if the household is doing well. Meat is a rarity. It's not a daily expectation, and it appeared mostly on feast days and celebrations. So you're not starving most of the time, but you're rarely far from the thought of it. So while we're on the subject of food, let me clear up one more thing that trips up almost everyone, because the shape of the day's meals aren't the shape that you now know. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner in the modern sense didn't exist then. The main meal of the day was called dinner, but you actually ate it late in the morning or around midday, not in the evening. The word itself gives the game away. Dinner comes from an old French word meaning more or less to break the fast. Then at dusk came a lighter meal called supper, often little more than pottage and bread, something gentle to end the day on. So there were only two meals, the big one at midday and the small one at nightfall. And this was the basic rhythm for 9 out of 10 people. So what about breakfast, you ask? Well, for a long stretch, it barely counted as a meal at all. It had a faintly disreputable reputation among the well-to-do, who felt a respectable person ought to be able to hold out until dinner. But a laborer facing hours of brutal work from first light plainly couldn't. So ordinary working people ate something early. It might have been just a bit of bread and some ale just to get them going. As for lunch, that's absolutely a modern invention. There was no midday lunch, as we mean it today. The word only settled into that job centuries later, once dinner had gradually drifted later and later through the ages, from, mid-morning to the late afternoon, and then finally into the early evening, the slot that we give it now, leaving a big empty gap in the middle of the day that lunch quietly moved in to fill. So if you sat down expecting 3 neat meals at 8 a.m., 1 p.m., and 7 p.m., you would spend your first day in the 14th century politely and hungrily confused. And I think that's pretty much where I would fail. So I touched on hunger a moment ago, but I want to circle back to that single force looming behind it, because in a sense, it was the greatest killer of all, greater even than the famine itself, since it was the thing that caused the famine in the first place. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So for us, weather is mostly small talk, a mild inconvenience that decides whether we carry an umbrella or not. For a medieval farmer, the sky was a matter of survival, studied every single day with an intensity that is genuinely difficult for any modern person to really appreciate. Picture what a single bad spell could do. 3 weeks of unrelenting rain, and your wheat begins to rot where it stands in the waterlogged field. The road outside dissolves into an impassable swamp. The river swells and bursts its banks, drowning the low meadows where your animals should be grazing. The roof begins to leak, so the inside of your home turns damp and cold. Out in the sodden pasture, the cow goes lame with foot rot. And in the barn, the precious hay you were storing for winter starts to grow mold. And here's the truly frightening thing, I think. These disasters didn't arrive politely one at a time. They tended to cascade each other, each one feeding the next, until your entire fragile livelihood seemed to be unraveling at once. And there was almost nothing that you could do to stop it. You couldn't command the clouds. You could only watch the horizon and pray and hope the rain would break before your world did. That's why medieval people read the sky like sacred text. Good weather meant they would live. Bad weather meant they might not. And there was precious little in between. So now you're thirsty. And here we reach one of the quiet horrors of daily life. The nearest stream isn't just your drinking supply. It's also simultaneously the village sewer, the place the animals wade in to drink, the spot where people wash their filthy clothes, and the drain where waste and the occasional rotting carcass kind of end up. Nobody in this world understands why that combination is dangerous, because the germ theory of disease is still 500 years away. But they have learned through hard experience that water can make you violently and sometimes fatally ill. So the real reason medieval people drank so much weak ale, and it's worth clearing up another myth here, they weren't a population of cheerful drunks. The brewing process involved boiling the water, which, though nobody knew the mechanism, actually killed off a great many of the things that would otherwise have made them sick. They did it so they could actually make ale that families drank through the days, that was very low in alcohol, but more importantly, comparatively safe. You're not choosing a tankard because you love the taste, because the taste wasn't that great. You're choosing the beverage least likely to send you running for the nearest ditch. Survival in the 14th century is often about picking the least dangerous option available. So you step outside now, so let's talk about the smell, because that, folks, deserves its own chapter. There are no sewer systems in the modern sense. Human waste is actually collected in cesspits dug behind the houses. And when they overflow, it runs into open channels down the middle of the street, or simply onto the road itself. And that's only the beginning of what your nose has to contend with on an average morning. Layer on top of that, the manure of horses and pigs, piles of rotting food scraps, the corpses of dead dogs and cats that nobody has cleared, and of course then the truly pungent trades. Slaughterhouses dumped their offal wherever it was convenient, mostly right outside their doors, which would then have it running down the streets with everything else. Tanners actually cured leather using a revolting brew of urine and animal brains. And the reek of a tannery could actually travel for streets, if not miles. In the towns especially, the combined stench could be genuinely overpowering to a modern nose. And this isn't merely an unpleasant detail. In London, the authorities repeatedly had to order the butchers to stop throwing animal remains into the streets, which would then flow into the Thames, because the river had become so foul that it was actually a public scandal. The medieval town assaulted every sense you had, and it literally started from the moment that you opened the door. So we've talked about how this world smelled, but I want you to hear it too, because the soundscape of the 14th century was utterly unlike anything in your ears today. Of course, there were no engines, there were no aircraft overhead, there was no hum of electricity, none of the mechanical background noise that, fills every modern moment. Most mornings began instead with birdsong, the restless sounds of livestock, the toll of the church bell, dogs barking somewhere across the field, maybe even the bite of an axe into timber, and then the slow rhythmic creak of wooden cartwheels along a rutted track. It was a much quieter world, but still far from a silent one, and every sound carried meaning. And then, of course, there was the night. Once the fire died down, the darkness became almost absolute. A blackness so complete that it's genuinely hard for us to imagine now, surrounded as we are by artificial light. In that deep dark, every unfamiliar sound beyond the door took on a weight that we've nearly forgotten. Was that a fox or a wolf in the wider regions where they still lingered? Was that a stranger moving in the lane, or simply the wind stirring the trees? Your ears did work at night that your eyes couldn't, and the imagination would have absolutely filled every gap. The world after sunset belonged to things that you could hear but never see, and that alone made the night a place to be feared. So, let's say that something goes wrong today, as it so often does, and you fall ill. Here's the truly frightening part. In 1350, you actually don't know what bacteria are. You don't know that viruses exist. You have no idea that fleas in your bedding can actually carry a plague capable of erasing half your county. And the crucial point is that your doctor doesn't know any of this stuff either. Medieval medicine is intelligent for sure, and it's absolutely trying hard, but it's working from a completely mistaken picture of how the body and disease actually operate. So when illness strikes, it's blamed on a whole menu of invisible culprits. Perhaps it's the bad air, a poisonous vapor rising from the marshes and the filth. Perhaps it's divine punishment for your sins. Perhaps the planets have drifted into an unlikely alignment, or an evil spirit has taken a great interest in you. The most respected theory held that your body contained 4 humors, and that sickness came from those humors falling out of balance. The treatments followed logically from that theory, which is exactly the problem. You might be bled with a knife or with leeches, You might be made to vomit or purge. You might be dosed with herbal remedies and prayed over. Some of it actually did no harm, and a few of the herbal treatments would have genuinely helped. But the bloodletting with a rusty knife, a weakened patient, often then did the opposite of healing. And now and then, the cure was considerably more dangerous than the disease that it was actually meant to fix. Now think about the tools that you had to handle every single day, because in a world without antibiotics, your ordinary work is quite literally lethal. You labor with axes and knives, with heavy plows, with unpredictable horses, with lumbering carts, with boiling water, and of course, open flames. Injuries aren't a rare event. They're simply part of the texture of life, and any of them can actually open a door that can never be closed again. And of course, the real killer is rarely the wound itself. It's what comes afterward. A splinter drives under the skin, and the flesh around it swells and it festers. A broken leg, badly set, turns black with gangrene. A small cut on the hand becomes an angry red streak crawling up the arm. And here's the thing, there's nothing that anyone can do to stop it. Today, we actually deal with these things with a course of tablets, and we actually don't really give them much thought. In the 14th century, an infection that we would now consider trivial could, and frequently did, kill an otherwise healthy adult. The distance between a minor mishap and a fatal one was actually terrifyingly short, and every single person knew it. And here's another danger that you might not have expected, and it's hiding in your daily bread. On the positive side, sugar is a rare and expensive import, so you're largely spared the kind of tooth decay that plagues the modern mouth. But your teeth are still in serious trouble, and the culprit is actually the bread itself. Grain was ground between large millstones, and tiny fragments of grit and stone were shed into the flour with every batch. That means that every single loaf you eat carries a faint sprinkling of abrasive grit. And over the years, it slowly grinds your teeth down like sandpaper. Archaeologists examining medieval skeletons routinely find severe dental wear in people who were only middle-aged. The enamel actually worn flat and the sensitive interior exposed. And of course, a badly worn or broken tooth isn't just painful. An untreated abscess can spread into the jawbone and from there into the bloodstream. And in a world with no dentists and no antibiotics, a rotten tooth was entirely capable of killing you. Something as small and as ordinary as your daily bread was very gently working against you. So if you're a woman in this world, there's a particular danger that shadows your entire adult life. And it's one of the most perilous things you will ever do. Childbirth in the 14th century is a genuine gamble, undertaken again and again, with your life placed on the table every single time. Of course, the estimates vary, but something in the region of one mother in 20 would have died from complications related to pregnancy and birth across her childbearing years. And of course, that risk climbed with every additional child she bore. So consider everything that's missing. There is, no safe surgical delivery that reliably saves both mother and baby. There's no antibiotics to fight the infection that would so often follow a difficult childbirth. There are no blood transfusions for a woman who is hemorrhaging, and no real understanding of why washing hands might matter. Birth is attended by experienced midwives who, I have to say, did remarkable work with the knowledge that they had. But they were fighting with both hands tied. Every pregnancy carried a real and openly acknowledged chance of death, which is why expectant mothers often made their spiritual preparations in advance. Bringing life into the world was itself, one of the greatest risks that life contained. The other thing to think about too is you're also never really alone because you share your home and your village with a vast supporting cast of animals. And I have to say, not all of them are welcome. There are the useful ones, of course. Pigs, rooting through lanes, chicken and geese underfoot, dogs and the horses, and oxen that do the heavy work. During the coldest months, many families even brought their livestock indoors at night, letting the warmth of the animals' bodies help heat the house. But every animal you live beside brings uninvited passengers. Rats thrive in the thatch and the grain stores. Fleas, lice, and ticks move freely between beasts and people, and then back again. Sharing your living space with animals meant sharing their parasites. And that constant itching intimacy, it's not going to be merely uncomfortable. It's a highway for disease, quietly ferrying infection from creature to creature, and of course, eventually to you. The very warmth that helped you survive a bitter winter night was also unknowingly putting you at risk. So many of the dangers that we've discussed are physical, but there was another threat that was social and economic, and it could be just as devastating to your prospects of survival. A great many peasants weren't free in the way that we understand freedom today. If you were what was called a villein, Villein, you were actually legally bound to the manor and to the lord who held it. And you couldn't simply just pack up and leave of search of a better life elsewhere. Your labor, your land, and even your time belonged in a real sense to the lord of the manor. In exchange for strips of land that fed your family, you owed a formidable list of obligations. You were required to work the lord's own fields for a set number of days each week, precisely when your own crops might need your attention. You paid rents and fines and a bewildering array of duties. Of course, the church would take its tithe as well, a tenth of what you produced, and the lord of the manor could demand payments when your daughter married or when the head of your household died. All of this meant that even a productive year could be quietly stripped of its surplus, leaving you with little cushion against the next disaster. And when a powerful lord or a distant king needed extra money for a war, the demands only grew heavier. So your survival depended not only on the weather and your health, but on the appetites of the people who ruled over you. The other thing I think we should keep in mind is that this wasn't a peaceful, sleepy countryside either, because 14th century England could be a genuinely violent place. Local feuds simmered between families and could easily erupt into bloodshed. Bandits preyed on the roads. Powerful nobles kept armed retainers who weren't always as careful about the law. Beyond your village, the long grinding conflict of the 100 Years' War actually pulled men away to fight and die in France. And in the north, well, the Scottish raiders brought fire and slaughter across the border counties. Carrying a knife or a staff was completely ordinary, partly for work and partly for protection. And of course, disputes could turn deadly with alarming speed. Justice, when it arrived, wasn't gentle either. The punishment for theft was death by hanging. The punishment for treason was deliberately horrific, designed as a public spectacle of suffering to warn everyone watching. This was a society that met danger with hard edges, and violence, whether private, military, or judicial, was simply one more hazard, woven into the fabric of your 14th century day. Then suppose you needed to travel, perhaps to the nearest market town, to see a distant relative, or on a pilgrimage to a famous shrine. Leaving the familiar boundaries of your own village introduced a whole new category of risk, because the roads of medieval England were nothing like the reliable highways that we take for granted today. Most were little more than rutted tracks that dissolved into deep, sucking mud with every spell of wet weather. And a journey, even if only a few miles, could become an exhausting ordeal that swallowed an entire day. And of course, the dangers weren't merely uncomfortable. There were no signposts whatsoever and no accurate maps for ordinary travelers. So becoming lost in unfamiliar country was genuinely easy. And being caught out after dark far from shelter, could expose you not only to the cold and the elements. More frightening still were the people that you might meet. Robbers and outlaws were a real hazard on the lonelier stretches, and a lone traveler carrying goods or even just a little bit of money was a tempting target. Rivers, of course, had to be crossed at fords that could turn treacherous after rain, and drowning was a surprisingly common way to die. And this is one reason people so often traveled in groups, seeking the safety of numbers, and why the hospitality offered by monasteries and inns was actually so genuinely valued. The world beyond your village was wilder, stranger, and of course considerably more dangerous than the fields that you knew. So to understand how people endured all of this, you have to understand the immense presence of the church, because religion saturated every corner of medieval life in a way that's difficult for us to understand today. You know, the rhythm of your entire year was set by the Christian calendar, with its feast days, its fasts, and its holy seasons. You know, the village church was the beating heart of the community, and its bells actually marked the hours of your day. Faith wasn't one compartment of life among many. It was actually the framework that gave the whole precarious business its meaning. That faith was a source of profound comfort and also of genuine dread. On one hand, it promised that suffering had a purpose and that a better existence awaited the faithful, beyond death. And of course, that was no small thing in a world so full of loss. On the other hand, the medieval imagination pictured hell in vivid and terrifying detail, and the fear of eternal punishment was very real. You know, when the Black Death came, many understandably interpreted it as the wrath of God unleashed upon a sinful world. And of course, that only deepened your terror. Yet the same institution also provided a genuine safety net. You know, monasteries offered charity to the poor and to the sick. The parish supported its most desperate members. And the shared rituals of worship, well, they would have bound people together in the very face of a hostile world. Faith could frighten you, but it could also carry you through the very worst that life could do. So now we come to the shadow that falls across this entire century, the catastrophe against which every other danger seems almost small by comparison. Nothing else actually compares to it. Between 1348 and 1350, the disease that we now call the Black Death swept into England, and the world simply came apart. In the space of those few years, something like half the population died. Not half the sick, half of everyone. And I think the horror of it was total and indiscriminate. You know, priests who came to comfort the dying caught it, and they died. Physicians died. Lords in their manor houses died alongside the peasants in their huts. And the king himself lived in complete fear of it. Whole villages were emptied so completely that they were abandoned forever. And you can still find their faint outlines in English fields today. The dead came so fast and furious that ordinary burial broke down and mass graves became a grim necessity. And through all of it, nobody understood what was happening or why. You would watch a perfectly healthy neighbor wake with a fever, come out in dark swellings, and be dead within a few days. If you lived through those years, you almost certainly knew dozens, if not more, people who didn't. And you carried that loss for the rest of your life. Fields would have gone unplowed because there was nobody left to work them. Sheep wandered untended across the hills, and entire villages simply fell silent. I think the strangest part of the story, though, is what happens next, because a catastrophe of that scale, well, it actually reshapes the world for the survivors. With so many workers dead, the labor of those who remained suddenly became far more valuable than it had before. Peasants who had once been trapped at the bottom of a rigid order found that they could demand better wages and better terms, and many quietly walked away from the harsh lords in search of them. The old certainties had been shaken to their foundations, and in the decades that followed, that new confidence helped fuel serious unrest, including the great uprising we remember as the Peasants' Revolt. Yes, the plague was an unimaginable tragedy, but for the ordinary survivors, it also, paradoxically, cracked open a door towards a freer, better future. Even the turning of the seasons could be an enemy to you, and winter in particular had long teeth. So your house isn't insulated in any meaningful way whatsoever, and the cold seeps through the walls and the floor and settles into your bones. Fuel for the fire costs money or hard labor to gather, so its warmth is actually rationed. And crucially, your food stores, laid down from the autumn harvest, are steadily dwindling with every week that passes. So a winter that ran a little longer or a little harder than expected didn't just make you miserable, it brought the real threat of hunger as the last of the stores ran out before the spring could replace them. Clothing of wool and linen offered only a small defense against a harsh frost. And in every age, it was the very old and the very young who were most exposed, the ones least able to withstand a season of cold and short rations. You know, winter wasn't just merely uncomfortable, folks. For the frailest among you, it could be the thing that finally tips the balance. You know, the people of the 14th century lived with death as a constant and intimate companion, and that shaped the emotional texture of their lives in ways that I think are worth talking about just for a moment. Imagine the church bell begins to toll across the fields, and your very first thought is not idle curiosity, but a cold flicker of dread. Who's died now? Imagine your small child wakes in the night, flushed and burning with fever, and you understand the terrible clarity that there is essentially nothing you can do but hold them and wait and pray. Imagine your husband sets off for the market town on an unremarkable morning, and a quiet voice at the back of your mind reminds you that he might simply never come home. Imagine you glance up from your work, you see a column of smoke rising on the horizon, and for one frozen moment, you can't tell whether it's a neighbor's chimney or an entire village burning to the ground. So what I do know is that this wasn't paranoia, and it certainly wasn't weakness. It was a perfectly rational response to a world in which sudden arbitrary loss was an ordinary feature of life rather than a rare catastrophe. The people who lived this way developed a kind of emotional endurance that most of us would struggle to summon, a capacity to keep functioning, to keep loving and working and planning while quietly aware that any of it could be snatched away with almost no warning. So they lived for the moment. They weren't numb to grief, and the records showed that they felt their losses as keenly as we felt ours. But they learned to live alongside an uncertainty that would frankly overwhelm certainly me today. So much of what I've discussed, you know, the faith, the rituals, the tight bonds of the community, was partly an answer to that fear, a way of holding steady, if you like, in a world that offered no guarantees. If you want to truly understand the medieval mind, I think you have to feel that low, ever-present hum of awareness that everything you loved was on loan, and it could be called back at any time. But here's the important message. I think we should feel that way today. We take everything for granted. We don't live in the present. So by now, you're picturing an existence of unbroken gloom. And I'm sorry that I had to project that on you. But it's at this moment I want to gently correct that, because it would be the biggest misunderstanding of all. Life in the 14th century was hard and dangerous, yes, but it wasn't one long funeral. And I know that you might be mistaken for thinking that after listening to this particular podcast. People then as now were gloriously, stubbornly alive. They fell in love and they married. They danced at weddings. They told jokes that would still make you laugh. Many of them far ruder than you might expect. So let me take you inside one such evening, because it's every bit as real as the hardship that we've described in this podcast. Picture the day's work is finally finished, and a church festival just beginning as the light turns golden across the fields. Somewhere, a fiddle strikes up a tune, and people begin to dance on the trampled grass. There is fresh bread, still warm from the oven, and ale passing freely from hand to hand. Children chase one another between the legs of the grown-ups, shrieking with delight. And for this one evening, with the music playing and everyone you love gathered close, life feels, I can only imagine, not merely bearable, but genuinely, gloriously wonderful. Hold on to that picture, please, because here is the strange truth of it. The harder the ordinary days were, the more brightly an evening like this must have shone. Children invented games out of nothing, as children always have. The alehouse buzzed with gossip and argument and song. The calendar was studied with village festivals and church feast days, which doubled as precious holidays from labor. People would have sang together while they worked in the fields because rhythm made the work lighter. And here's the part I find genuinely moving, because danger was such a constant companion. The moments of joy, I think, would have burned brighter than they do for us today. When you don't know whether you'll see another harvest, a warm evening of music and laughter, well, it's not a small thing. It's everything. So we began this journey with you as a survivor of 30, and I'd like to end it by imagining that, against all the odds that we've piled up today, you simply kept going. And you actually reached the age of 65. And of course, it did happen. It was uncommon, and it had to be earned the hard way, but it happened. And it's worth picturing what that hard-worn old age truly looked like, because it makes a quiet and rather beautiful contrast with where I started earlier on this morning. Your body would now carry the entire record of your lifetime of labor. Your hands would be stiff and gnarled from decades of work in all weathers. Your eyesight would have begun to dim, and your back aches with every moment. You no longer take the lead in the heavy work of the fields because your sons and their sons shoulder that burden now, while you turn your hand to the gentler tasks. You might sit in the doorway mending tools. You mind the smallest children, and you keep a watchful eye on the animals. But something remarkable has quietly happened to your place in the world. In a community with almost no books whatsoever, no records, and none of the ways that we now use to store the past, you have actually become a living archive of memory. You remember the Great Famine because you were a small child when the rains wouldn't stop and the food ran out. You remember the faces and the events that no document anywhere has preserved. And so in the long evenings, the young ones gather around you to hear you speak. And for a while, you're not merely a worn-out old body resting in a doorway. You are the keeper of the village's memory, one of the last living threads connecting the present to a world that vanished half a century ago. To grow old in the 14th century was rare, and it was undeniably hard. But I think it also carried a genuine and hard-earned dignity. You had survived everything the world could throw at you, and that alone made you worth listening to. As I finish, let's return to the question that I started with. How hard was it, really, to survive a single day in the 14th century? The honest answer is that it was extremely hard, but it was very far from impossible. The dangers were real, and they were everywhere. But they were also, in a sense, a series of gates. If you made it through childhood, dodged the famines, escaped the plague, avoided a fatal accident, survived childbirth, and outran the infections that stalked every wound, and then reaching 60 or even 70, well, it was entirely achievable. Old age existed, but it had to be earned. And I think in the end, it's the truest way to understand this world. Medieval life was less about the slow business of growing old and more about surviving one ordinary day, and then the next, and then the one after that. The people of 14th century England rarely thought of themselves as brave. They weren't trying to conquer history or become legends. They simply woke each morning and did what human beings have always done. They looked after their families, they laughed when they could with their friends, they mourned when they had to, and they hoped tomorrow would be kinder than yesterday. And perhaps there's a message there for us now, and perhaps it's also why they still deserve our admiration 600 years later. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.